My name is Mallory Slusser, and I will be the interviewer, and we are interviewing Lonna Malmsheimer. Today is February 18th, 2015, and we are at Lonna's house. So right now we're just going to begin interviewing for the LGBT History Project. So why don't we start off with where you grew up?
I grew up in western Pennsylvania in a small town called Tarentum.
Okay. And did you go to school there? How long did you stay in the area?
Went clear through primary and secondary schooling in Tarentum, yes.
And then you moved?
Then I went away to school.
Boarding school?
No.
Or?
I graduated from high school and I went away to
Okay.
college.
Okay. And where did you go to college?
Penn State University.
Penn State. And you studied?
My undergraduate degree's in science, and it actually is a general science degree. But my interests had changed by the end of my undergraduate career, so my graduate work's different.
Okay. And then what did you study in graduate school?
First, I got a master's at Penn State also in English.
Okay.
And then I went on for a PhD at the University of Minnesota, which I got in American Studies.
Okay. And then from there, did you go straight into teaching at Dickinson, or was there anything?
As soon as I got my PhD, yeah.
Okay.
And I taught at San Diego State University for a few years, and then came to Dickinson as the only person in American Studies, and of course, at the same time, the chair of American Studies. It's not quite the only person. There were people in the disciplines that worked with American Studies at that point, but I was the only person who was full-time American Studies.
And how long were you teaching there?
Pardon?
How long were you teaching there?
37 years, something like, and now I'm teaching there again, so I don't know quite how to.
You're just still going?
Because I haven't been teaching for the last 5 years until now.
And, okay. How about your family life?
I grew up in a extremely conservative, fundamentalist family. And I had 2 sisters, both younger, and a large, extremely close, extended family. We met at my grandmother's every Sunday. So my extended family, and that would be like 25 to 30 people by the time I'm 15. We were at my grandmother's until she died, and then that Sunday went away.
Would you say you're still close to your family?
I was extremely close to my grandmother. I can't remember anyone in my childhood that I cared more for except my own parents. She was my sisters have a little different view of her than I do. I was very close to her. Whenever I wanted to get away from my parents and my sisters, I would go to my grandmother's house. My grandmother's house was what seemed a terrible long walk from my home then, but it was about 4 or 5 town blocks.
Oh, wow.
And so whenever I wanted to escape, as soon as I was old enough to be allowed to go that distance myself, I would go to my grandmother's and hang out with Grandma. And one of the great things about my grandmother is she never told me to go away. So when her friends, her women friends, would come to hang out and have coffee and talk, she let me be there. I learned an awful lot from those conversations, just because she didn't send me away. My sisters see her as a very real disciplinarian. I don't see her that way. because I can't remember her ever saying a negative thing to me. She's the only one in the world who ever called me Lonnie. And she, apparently what my sisters say is that every once in a while she would give my mother a lecture, which I had no idea. And she would say, those girls are getting out of hand. And then suddenly there would be this new regime in the house with my mother becoming much more strict with us. And I could never figure that out.
Oh, God.
Anyway.
What would you say your family life is like now then?
Now?
Yes.
I live alone.
Do you contact anyone? Do you have...
My mother has died.
Mm-hmm.
If you want a whole family history, I'll have to go back again. So I graduated from Penn State and then went to work for 2 years as an engineer at AT&T in Manhattan. And then came back to Penn State to do my master's degree in English. And there, and this is why I'm saying this, there met my husband. And we were together for 22 years. His name was Richard Malmsheimer, and I didn't have that name before I married.
All right. And then you said you had a grandson. What about...
I do. I actually, then Richard and I had 2 sons, Matthew and Aaron. And Matthew is 40 this year. Take a deep breath. And my grandson is Isaac, and he is 8. And he and his mother and father live in Portland, Oregon. And my sisters live in Arlington, Virginia, actually Falls Church, Virginia, and Minneapolis, Minnesota, where they went to school too, and stayed in Minneapolis, actually St. Paul. So I'm pretty much in touch with them. Both of all of us, each of us, had 2 sons. And this is something I say my mother never quite forgave, because she came from a family of 5 girls, and she had a family of 3 girls, and she used to try to keep us having babies in order to get at least 1 girl.
Oh my God.
But we didn't. It took one of our sons to his wife finally had a little girl, and she's only 4 years old now.
Was she around when the daughter or the girl was born? Your mother?
Oh, I don't think so. She had met her brother, the little girl's brother. She had met Ethan, but I don't think she had met Kyle.
Okay. Let's see here. Talked about all of that. And you said that you had a very, as far as your religious affiliation, you were saying it was more like...
What were you asking?
Your religious affiliation. You were saying it was more like...
my family, very fundamentalist,
Mm-hmm.
through and through. My father, I'm the only one of the 3 daughters that actually remember my mother and father before my father got very ill, and he was very sick for about 1.5 years, and I think I was 11 to 12 at that point. And he had been extremely not religious until that period of time, and then he became much more religious, and my mother kind of followed him in both respects, although she was raised in a deeply fundamentalist family. So the shift that occurred when I was 11 or 12 in the family from all kinds of activities into largely church activities, that happened obviously because of pressures that the family were feeling. I remember it being hard. at the time, but I don't think my sisters do. We couldn't see my father even. He had tuberculosis. And the way they treated tuberculosis at that time was to put people in a sanitarium and to collapse the lung. And I could see him from a window, a second-story window, but that's the only way I could see him for that year and a half. We weren't allowed in the building even.
But he did get better then. He did get better then from the tuberculosis.
And his story's pretty interesting too. He is the first person in Western Pennsylvania. He went to West Penn Hospital. Eventually they sent him to the hospital because apparently he also had lung cancer at the same time. At least that's what they said. It could have been a misdiagnosis. They wouldn't have admitted that as the way I would see it. But they removed his left lung, and he was the first person in Western Pennsylvania to have a lung removed and live. And he lived quite a long life after that. At the time, he was 30, and he lived to 80.
Oh, wow. Moving on.
I don't know where we are.
Let's see. So.
We were talking to me about religion, and the family got religion, and this is a Campbellite church, a Church of Christ, it's called. My father became an elder in the church. My mother was always a deaconess. We went to church every Sunday and many days in between. We were very active in choir and Sunday school and all the activities that happen in a church congregation. My father was serious enough about religion at that point that he actually tithed. He actually gave 1/10 of his income, which he got challenged on from time to time by the IRS, but he had the record, so there you are. Religion, I was extremely religious at that point, as was the whole family.
Would you say you still are?
You're going to have to speak louder.
Would you say that you still are?
Religious?
Yeah,
No.
that extent.
I really am not. Really am not. Have moved very much away from religion.
Okay. Do you know when that happened?
When that happened?
Yes.
Over the course of undergraduate school. I think it's a fairly common story. And it may even be more common to kids who grow up in very strict families religiously as opposed to kids that have a little more latitude. I don't know that that's the case. I know that it broke my mother's heart. All three of us are very secular, and I know that troubled her. And she got increasingly religious as she got older, so that it was hard for her.
Okay, so kind of switching topics here. When did you start getting involved with the LGBT History Project?
The project? Only 18 months ago.
So this is still kind of new for you as well?
2 years ago, maybe. Well, I had retired and was looking for something not just of interest, but that would contribute in some way to do. And this just kind of popped up.
Did you have any prior experience with that population?
Well, I was with a woman. I've been married twice. Once to a man and the second time to a woman.
And when was that?
When
The
did I
second
marry the
marriage?
woman?
Yes.
That'd be now 26, 27 years ago. Each of my marriages lasted for 22 years.
Oh, wow. And what happened with her, if you don't mind talking about it?
She left, to put it bluntly. I got ditched. She fell in love with someone else and left. Gee, it's now 5 or 6 years.
Um, do you think with the whole, was there anything happening in your life at the time, like when you, I don't know how to phrase this. Okay, let's go with this. How has your identity like affected any other aspects of your life, going from like being married to a man and then being with a woman?
Well, I suppose technically I'm bisexual given my history. But I have identified as lesbian since I was about 44 years old. And that's partly political in my case. That is, to identify as lesbian as opposed to bi. How has it affected my life? Whoa. Where to begin with that? I was deeply in love with a woman when I was an undergraduate in college. She was my roommate for 3 years. And when we left college, she broke up with me. And I just said, that's the end of that. I was too hurt by that to even think of going with another woman at that time. And I just swore off women. Pretty much.
That's an interesting story. Did it have any...
It gets more complicated.
Well, go ahead.
My former partner, who I married in, it was 1990, probably 2000. It would have been about now 15 years ago. We couldn't get married. We had been together for many years by this time. And little did I know, we were sort of more toward the end of our relationship than in the beginning, but we went to Canada the minute Canada had marriage availability. We had wanted to get married in Portland, Oregon, and for a very brief period of time, my son's a lawyer there, for a very brief period of time, Oregon was giving marriage licenses, and we wanted to go out there, get the license, and get married. At the time, my son was a clerk for the appeals court of Oregon, and one of his judges had agreed to marry us. And just 2 to 3 days before we would have gone, Oregon shut down the marriage thing again. So we went to Vancouver in Canada and had the wedding there. I'm not sure. I'm supposed to be answering a question about how my sexual orientation has affected my life.
Like family?
Okay. So I swore off girls, and I met my former husband, who is still probably my deepest friend in the world, as a graduate student in English at Penn State. And we both got PhDs there. How much more, I don't know, affected my life? Well, it's just something that's with you all the time, no matter who you're connected to and so forth and so on. I am absolutely certain that it influenced an awful lot of changes from my background to my belief systems and teaching as a professor, because it permitted me, I believe, to in effect become interested in and champion, or at least work for, broader social equality in the United States. And I would say virtually all of my teaching wasn't directed toward that, but it was informed by that. So it affected me professionally, and it affected me personally. It certainly affected associations that I developed with students that moved even beyond their college years and that sort of thing. I did in the last 10 years, I think it was, teach Gay in America at Dickinson. It was the first time Gay in America was taught. It was the first time anything focused on gay or lesbian issues was taught at Dickinson. And I did that for at least 10 years. And when I first did it, we were worried about the students, and the students were worried, such that we concealed the topic of the course. We just called it Topics in American Studies. And the first day, before that, the word would get out, but I would tell the class, this is a course on LGBT matters. It's going to be a gay positive course, and if you don't want either of those things, now is the time to find another class. So it affected my professional life also. And I was definitely activist at Dickinson as a prof in seeking to diversify the college. When I arrived at the college, it was as white as these walls. And of course, I'm a white person. Mm-hmm. But I had already been doing anti-war and civil rights work in Minnesota for years. My former husband and I had founded a group called the Minnesota Peace Cooperative, which was an umbrella organization that gathered Minnesotans gathered organizations that opposed the war in Vietnam. And we became serious organizers of that, as well as civil rights activity. So when I came to Dickinson, and it wasn't just me, the whole group of people that came the year I came were quite a shock to Dickinson, I think. Well, I know they were. We were. We called ourselves the young professors, and we would meet before faculty meetings, having a chat about what we thought about the issues that were coming up, and they weren't used to a cabal like that. And most of us were activist lefties, and so all of us pretty much wanted to see some change at the college, and did, in fact, accomplish quite a lot of change at the college. So I think that being gay or being bisexual, however you want to denominate me, given the mixed history I have, I feel definitely let me be able to understand the position that other minoritized people in the United States have been in. That it gave me not so much, well, I would say an empathic understanding of the other. And that also informed most of my work. So being who I was definitely, and I think it probably does for everybody, informed my activities as a professional as well as personally. Well,
How popular, did the Gay in America course change in popularity from when you first started to your last year of teaching it?
Well, part of this also was part of the, this was a period of, this is after I've been at the college, probably. By that time, at least a dozen years. So it's well into my career at the college. We had had a dean of students whose name was Carmen Newberger, and she was only at the college for maybe, I'm thinking, 3 or 4 years. But she started and hired a woman in support of it, an allies group at the college. And it was the first group at the college that that was speaking at all about LGBT issues. And at that time, it was just gay and lesbian, and then it became LGB, and then it became LGBT, and then it became LGBTQ, and now it's LGBTQAA for both. Q is for, as I understand it, both queer and questioning, and A is for asexual, and the other A is for, I forget. Q was for both, was questioning too. Anyway, the Allies group was the only group on campus, and for some time it remained the only group on campus. And it was, in a way, I would say, sort of a cover for gay kids to be able to meet each other. And we met, I'm trying to think, did we meet weekly? We might have met that often, weekly or bi-weekly. And at that point, I was not out. Oh, yes, I was. This was after my second marriage. I think of myself as married to the second person a lot earlier than it actually occurred legally. And it would have been after that I was doing this teaching. But there was a whole lot of stuff that had to be done at the college in that respect. And one of the first things Allies went after was partner benefits. And they just wanted to see equality at the college, period. And partner benefits, I may have to stop for a minute. Partner benefits were a big deal. And of course, those of us who worked for the college wanted partner benefits. And eventually, it didn't take all that long, as I recall, maybe 6 or 8 months of agitation. And the students did most of the agitating. It's all right. And we got that. And Dickinson, I'm very proud to say, was the first college in Pennsylvania to have full partner benefits. University of Pennsylvania had a couple of things in their benefits that were available to partners rather than those who were married. But Dickinson is the first place. And we did lose at least one trustee because of that, who resigned rather than put his name on partner benefits for LGBT people. The extent of activism in that respect remained really, LGBTQ activism remained fairly low level, although it moved after maybe half a dozen years into a much more in step with other colleges and universities that had National Coming Out Week and that sort of, all that stuff was evolving at that time. It wasn't as if it was sitting there and then Dickinson did something. That was happening politically at the same time. I mean, you're looking at, from the time I was in University of Minnesota graduate school to the time I'd be talking about here, just about everything in the United States changed. Just about everything. The country became enormously richer after World War II. Now I'm talking like a historian, which I am. And virtually all minoritized groups eventually were pushing for at least the protection of their civil rights, if not some more extended kinds of protection like anti-hate crimes legislation and that sort of thing. So all of that was evolving even while I was teaching this, and that actually was a great kind of, you don't very often get the world to hand you a place where you can have your students practically work outside the classroom to understand what's going on as well. And historically, we went through so much change, and we were agitating for all kinds of change. Yeah, those of us who came into the professoriate in that class that I was talking about, we were all agitators, every one of us, and we continued to be agitators till we retired. It was just, by that time, in our blood. I'm not sure where we are either.
Did you want to take a break?
Oh, it's all right. I'm all right.
Okay. I know before we had talked about the course and just how everything was going on at Dickinson, we were kind of talking about like if your orientation maybe had an influence on your family, your social life. I know when you were training us, you said people lost friends.
Yeah, right. Well, 2 years after I came out, and my former husband came out. So this was a period of time in which our children had to learn a lot. Happily, they were not young. My youngest son was 17, and my oldest son was at NYU and a junior at NYU. So I remember my second partner was a former student, and I really quickly say former, because it just never would have happened otherwise. I don't know why I wanted to talk about that. Just a moment. Oh yes. Well, I had left and gotten an apartment in town, and my younger son spent weekends with me and that sort of thing, and with his father. But I'm very close to his father. I remained very close to his father throughout this entire transition. And actually, if you would, when people ask us about this, Richard and I, we say we had a great marriage and a great divorce. And that's one of the reasons we still remain very good friends, and also, of course, our children. Remind me where we are. You're talking about the effects of on my family life?
Mm-hmm. Family and then maybe social.
Right. So I left the marriage, but not the family, in a funny sort of way. And that remains the case. We still have holidays together and that sort of thing. And Richard has a partner now, and he comes to all of these things, marriages and that kind of stuff. So I suppose it was done maybe as smoothly as anything that shocking can be. Shocking to others. It was not shocking to us. It was shocking to others, no doubt. And it was disruptive to the family. I can remember that Aaron, my younger son, who was still in town at the time this happened, would get annoyed at having to not be at his house but be at my apartment. And I would say, well, what is the reason here? Because if you want to talk about this, we can talk about this. And he said, well, it's inconvenient. And that was it. And the reason I was telling that story was my second partner had come into the Allies group and had gotten to know some other people on campus, and also had a friend still on campus. And so the word sort of got out somehow. And so Dickinson was, I wasn't coming out, I was being outed by a former student, a much younger student. And that worried me a lot, because I did not want my sons to find this out from someone else. And so I called Matt back from college, and we had a family get-together about it all. So it affected the family in that way, but in many ways I think we kept as much stability in the family as we could, because we valued it, while we were in fact going different directions at that point. Richard is a psychotherapist. So he was able to handle, I suspect, some of the things the boys needed to talk about that I think that they, in fact, knew my second partner by the time they got this news. So, and they really thought a lot of her by then. So I think their father was maybe a bigger shock, and it came later. And that also, I would say, as a prof, rather than just a person experiencing it, I think that's in general the case. I think gay men are very much more maligned and disliked, especially by other men. Or they get real intrigued with lesbians. They seem to, at any rate. There's apparently a great deal of porn, lesbian porn, that lesbians don't use because it's yeah. Lesbians don't look like that, to put it bluntly. So, you know, that's another thing that young people haven't a clue about how little we knew about sexuality, period, when we were 25 years old. I mean, none of this existed. We had court case after court case that finally freed up expression about sexuality at all. I mean, very famous novels. James Joyce's work was censored, and when it came into the country, when the novels were shipped, Ulysses in particular, shipped into the country, the post office would block it. There was a Comstock law, and the law was you can't send this pornography through the mail. Now, pornography. That is the way any kind of expression of homosexuality would have been seen then. It would have been seen as pornography. And one of the reasons that LGBT people are extremely against censoring pornography, which is quite a different thing now than it was then, is because they know that same-sex sex is going to be the first thing that gets banned. The first thing that's going to be out of here. So, boy, I really am wandering around, aren't I? Oh, I was talking about the boys, and Matthew at the time said he knew, and Aaron said he hadn't a clue. But they were both just great. Is she in the picture? Oh, Toshi, it's all right. My mother didn't know about this for quite a long time. And My father, by the time I came out to her, was already dead. So I never came out to him, although I don't imagine he would have blinked much. He was a pretty unshockable person, let's put it that way. My mother was very upset in large part because of the religious issue. And the reason I really know that is that after Melanie, my second partner, left the marriage, I went to see Mother. Mother lived in Pittsburgh all those years, and she said, "Don't get another woman." And I said, "Well," she said, "I want to see you in heaven. I won't be happy if you're not in heaven." And I know that she meant that in a very, very deep way, because that is the way that she saw the world. And I just said, "Mom, if you're in heaven, you won't miss me." We never talked about it much. I don't think it surprised a lot of other people, though. And I think when people come out, it doesn't surprise their friends very much. They very often know before somebody comes out to them. My family. Yeah, the boys were fine.
What about your sisters?
Oh, my sisters they were fine too, from moment one, really. And they had already gotten to know Melanie, who was around quite a bit. But I never even really came out to them. They just, it was there, you know. We never even talked about it until I came out to Mother, and then we were talking about Mother. And I have to say, even though I know she was terribly upset by this, and I suspect went through a good deal of agonizing, in the end, not even very long after, she said to me, "I love you no matter what." And that was about all we said about it afterwards. I think she was also concerned about how it might affect me professionally. I was totally unconcerned about that, which might have been stupid. But I had already had tenure. It's a huge deal. You don't get fired very easily if you have tenure.
Covered most of this. In what other ways are you engaged in the LGBT community?
Practically zero. I mean, I am engaged in other things with the LGBT Center since I got involved with the History Project. I actually found out about the History Project going to an event there, and I can't quite remember what it was, but it was something I wanted to attend, and I had seen some advertising on. And then they had this sign up for if you are interested in the History Project. And not very long after that, I think it was Barry Loveland, who is the chief architect of this project, put out a query to us asking if we knew anyone that would do training of people in oral history. And I just wrote back, "Yes, I'll do it, and I'll do it for free." Well, that works very well with any, startup organization, nonprofit, who are usually struggling for every penny. But we've done well. We've done this project very cheaply, frankly. The most expensive stuff is the equipment. So not an awful lot otherwise. And as a matter of fact, I could say at Dickinson, when I was still a full-time prof at Dickinson, I don't think I had any idea anything was going on in Harrisburg about this. Now, I had some former students who lived in Harrisburg, and I knew there was a small community of LGBT people there. But I had no idea about what I'm finding out doing interviewing for this project, which is that there was quite a bit of activity going on in central Pennsylvania, and with a significant reach. Even an organization before Stonewall. Now, if you know what Stonewall was, most things came after Stonewall. Most organizing even came after Stonewall, although there had been a different kind of organizing before Stonewall. Things got much more militant in the early 70s, and that's partly because of feminism. There's no question the women's movement is the chief engine that brought LGBT people into a civil rights activity as well. I think what happened to people was they looked at it and said, well, why should I not have the same rights everybody else does? And that just kept adding groups to it. The African American civil rights movement was the model for everybody. And it was incredibly powerful. And I can remember the first time I thought about that was when I was watching a news broadcast on Emmett Till. And Emmett Till was killed. I forget how old he was, maybe 14, 15 years old. And he made a comment to a woman in the South. He was from Chicago, I believe. And they lynched him. And it got it made national news in large part because his mother insisted on people seeing what his body looked like. Because she said, you have to see what this is about. A 15-year-old kid who is tortured and killed because of a remark he made. And that was the South for young black boys. And I think in some ways and in some places that remains the way things are, especially for black young men. But that affected me a lot. I remembered it very well. I didn't immediately become involved in political activity. That came later. But I can remember thinking, what is going on here? Actually, we were all pretty naive. We actually believed what they told us in school about the United States. We actually believed that everybody was equal in the United States and that we were all citizens of equal standing and so forth. And we even believed that there wasn't much of a class system in the United States. And we just bought the whole 50s line and the whole post-World War II line, which was, we are the most wonderful country in the entire world. We don't talk about the things we didn't do very well at. But we don't tell kids that either. We don't tell them the things that went wrong. And so everything got to be a shock for a while. Post-World War II, a very interesting historical period. Just the first 40 to 80. You have the whole 60s, which changed a lot more things than we've already talked about.
And you said you were politically involved. In what ways were you?
Mainly after I was working full-time, mainly through the politics at Dickinson. At that point, I was a young mother. My kids were, when we moved here, my kids were 2 2.5 and 6. So I was raising children, I was working full-time, and frankly, I look back on it now and wonder how we did it. I really do, because we didn't have good daycare then. We do at Dickinson now, a Dickinson daycare center that's fabulous. And so we were always looking for good ways for the children to be cared for, and we were also always trying to work to hand them off to each other, Richard and I. Richard, I have to say, was a equal parent in every respect. He was as much a parent as I was all the time the boys were living with us. So it was mainly with the Allies group and doing activities on campus, and getting the campus to be aware of all issues of diversity. And I worked with that all the way through my career. In fact, the last 4 years that I was working at Dickinson, I was not teaching, and I was a posse mentor. And I don't know whether you know what the posse program is. Well, I'll try to do that quickly. The posse program is a national program. It has, so I guess you might call them chapters, in close to a dozen maybe cities now. It didn't then when we first got there, but I was a posse mentor for 3 different posses at Dickinson. A posse is a group of promising kids coming out of inner cities who have shown leadership capacity, and it is a leadership scholarship given to them to bring them to colleges they probably wouldn't even consider. And Dickinson had been trying to diversify the student population for quite a long time, and we weren't being successful at it. We just weren't. And then we hired Joyce Bylander, who was Dean of Students at that point, and she is an African-American activist professional and has been for probably all her adult life. And she helped us find a way to support the posse program. Now, what the posse does, the Posse Foundation, with its people in the cities, get a group of people and present them as potential Dickinson students, and this at all the other colleges too. And then Dickinson makes its posse by accepting 10 to 12 of those individuals. The Posse Foundation does this in the fall, and then they train the students from the 1st of January or so on through to the fall. When they come to the colleges, they train them. They train them on what to expect. They train them and try to increase their skills in some ways, and they make a group of them so that they become a group of friends. So that, at the time, the word posse was a positive word in the African American community, describing your group of friends. It would be like saying your peeps now. And once we knew also from research that the prediction for graduation requires 2 things: that a student find a peer group that is supportive. And most people form a friendship group, if not on the hall, and you know the ways people do when they go to college and have to go through that, which is can be pretty traumatic for students. So the posses come with an automatic friend group. So the prediction for graduation is a group of peers that is supportive and a caring adult. And that is formally given to a posse, and that person's called a mentor. And that person meets the posse every 2 weeks for the first 2 years, and every week, and meets each individual student privately every 2 weeks for the first 2 years. And so is there to hear out what problems are occurring, what successes are, just being very involved with the individuals who are part of the posse. Well, because of where they come from, mainly inner cities, you're going to get a lot more diverse 10 or a dozen. Many of them are, we have 2 posses, one from New York and one from Los Angeles every year, and those students come with full scholarship, total, everything paid. And that's how you start to diversify when you have a hard time doing it. And the posse program has diversified the college a lot. And then just the very presence of the posses has helped us recruit other minoritized kids, because they come to campus and it doesn't look as white of the walls anymore. And so that was all part of and in that group are a lot of LGBT kids, it turns out. I've been surprised, actually, at how many of my posses were gay. And they certainly weren't selected in that way in any way. So we were talking about how was I connected to politics, I think.
Just, you said that you had been doing political involvement.
When I was still at the University of Minnesota, we were very involved in electoral politics in the DFL, which is the Democratic Farm Labor Party. But I did not get involved in electoral politics after I came to Dickinson. Mainly, I think, because central Pennsylvania is pretty dismal in terms of a Democrat. Your prospects for electing a Democrat to things in Carlisle are pretty dim. And I think, given how busy I was, and that's what I was talking about earlier, given how busy I was and how many responsibilities I had, it just wasn't something I was going to go for. And still don't. Not because I don't think we should elect good people. I think we should. But it's really tough in this area. My understanding of good people. I hurry to add, because I'm sure people think they're electing good people. Meanwhile, in Harrisburg, there was a Human Relations Commission developed. There was a whole push to get certain kinds of policy and law changed, and the people that we are interviewing have that to tell us about.
Let's see. Are there any important events or turning points that have happened in your life? I don't know. It's one of the
Important events.
Yeah, important events or turning points.
Oh, gee, a bunch of them. I think my father's illness was hugely impacted me. Certainly going to college was important. Having children was extremely important. Losing my second son was a devastating event. Both my marriages and divorces were important events. I don't really see my life in terms of events very readily, and I certainly don't see it in terms of larger events, like this happened during the Vietnam War. Although I might say that about something, I don't think of my life that way much. events. No.
So what challenges do you think still remain, like, for the LGBT community?
In Pennsylvania, the only law that has changed is the allowing of marriage, legalizing of marriage, which, by the way, allowed me to get a divorce. Because until you can get married in a place of residence, you can't get divorced because they don't recognize your marriage to begin with. So that just happened, what, 2 years ago at most? A year and a half? This year? Judge Jones, so Pennsylvania got marriage for LGBT people by being told it could not prohibit them by a federal judge who said you can't do this anymore. And of course it's part of a series of cases that are now going to go to the Supreme Court, and we're going to hear a decision on marriage in all of the United States from the Supreme Court by the end of the court session at this point. Apart from that, challenges in Pennsylvania are huge, maybe everywhere. In Pennsylvania, we don't have a hate crimes law. We're not included in it. We have a hate crimes law. LGBT people aren't included in it. They're not protected in terms of housing. They can be evicted for being gay. They are not protected in terms of their jobs. They can be fired for being gay, and it has happened in central Pennsylvania, and we are interviewing people that it has happened to. And that hasn't changed yet here. So Equality PA, which is a very active organization across Pennsylvania in legislative matters, is now pressing the legislature to get this other legislation done. I think they're going to have to press for a very long time, is my guess. People in this area are extremely conservative, and many extremely religious. And I don't see being extremely religious as necessarily being anti-gay, but many of the religions are. And more commonly, religious people, rather than the institutions, are anti-gay. And it's a very long-standing, almost universal dislike or prohibit or illegal. And of course, that's what it was in 1970. Their so-called sodomy laws were in most of the states. Sodomy, there's a wonderful article on this. Sodomy didn't have a universal definition. You could be a so-called sodomite in Pennsylvania, but not in West Virginia, because the things that constituted sodomy were different from state to state. And of course, people got all squeamish about saying what they meant by sodomy. So they weren't going to be putting it in the laws, and so when it got specific, it got to be pretty funny. There's a wonderful, wonderful scholarly article on the laws, comparing the laws in the states and talking about who would be a sodomite where. Anyway, but that use of that word in laws actually demonstrates the connection between religion and law on that issue, at least. Pennsylvania did not have a sodomy law, and does not, and never had to get rid of one. All of Pennsylvania law on how shall I put it, non-consensual sex has to do with they would call it deviant I forget the name of the law, but it's not a sodomy law. It is a law that turns on consent rather than a particular behavior. And so that one, gay people at least weren't thrown in jail for being gay here. Probably sent to institutions, though. Were. A lot of them were.
How long do you think?
Challenges, that's what you're asking.
Yeah, challenges.
A lot of things have changed in part because of AIDS. And it was a horrible, horrible scourge and remains so, although I was just going into the campus when I was going to meet with you, listening to NPR, and they were talking about they have found a new molecule that works to prevent AIDS infection. They don't call it a vaccine because it's different than a vaccine. It operates differently. You don't introduce the organism. This is he called it a molecule or a chemical that blocks the activities of the AIDS virus and might even be very useful in people that have already contracted it. Well, that's taken quite a while, and of course during the 80s, hundreds and hundreds of people died of AIDS. And AIDS made for discovery number one, there are many gay people in our midst, and we may not know it, but they are there, and then suddenly we know it because they're very sick. And when you see how that number of people, that gives a lie to the idea that being gay is very rare. And people used to think being gay was very, very rare, which it is not, and is not across all countries and all cultures. It's everywhere. We are everywhere. So things changed with AIDS because so many people were coming out, whether they wanted to or not, and also people were losing their children. Young men are the people who were dying. Men between the ages of 15 and 30 were massively the people who were dying of AIDS. And while there are horror stories about families that disowned and put out of their midst children who had gotten AIDS, that is not what happened always, or maybe even often. Families might be ashamed of it. They might not even tell you that's what happened, but when they were losing young men, they were rethinking, I would say, rethinking. And when the nation ignored this illness for so long, saying it was a gay disease and gay people aren't worth anything anyway, that became even worse in a lot of ways. And that's what activated some of the most militant of the activist LGBT groups, including especially ACT UP, which was ready to do all kinds of annoying, mainly annoying and inconveniencing sort of things, like stopping traffic or making it impossible to do business in this bank or whatever. They were ready to disrupt. And that eventually got certain kinds of response. Well, then suddenly people are coming out, and then people who aren't sick are coming out, and then people are realizing that their uncle who has a companion has probably been gay all of his life. And that has changed fundamentally, at least, I think, in many ways, the way the society reacts. What we still haven't got, and it may never happen, is really complete acceptance. I mean, one would look to a day when you didn't talk about gay marriage. Somebody married somebody, and it didn't matter what was there. But that's, of course, what we all hope for race, too. And the last 6 to 8 years, especially since we have had a black president, has certainly told us we aren't through that yet. And in fact, I have to say, as a person who has always been active in that cause as well, I'm stunned at how much racism is still very powerful in this country, and I am stunned by what people say, and I can't imagine what goes into the White House on a given day. It must be horrendous, because what people will say about it is horrendous. So the acceptance, I don't think we have that in any universal sense. And we certainly don't have it in some religious groups. And some religious groups make this the very point of their existence. I think of something like the 700 Club and Lon Mabon in Oregon that has the Oregon Citizens Alliance, and what they do is make an organization whose main purpose is anti-gay activity of one kind or another, either opposing laws or re-demonstrating against achievements that gays seek. But what it is primarily is a force for getting money. 700 Club gets a lot of money because it's willing to voice virulent anti-gay stuff. So you become a professional anti-gay. And that's the way you make your living. And that's certainly the case with a lot of organizations. Oh, yeah. I'm going to pull it off again, huh? Oh, well.
Let's see here. Do you think we missed anything as far as your memory bank?
Not that I can think of right now. I mean, there's a lot in 50 years of a person's life, but it's not occurring to me right now.